Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Irrational Labs open event for the month of February. For those of you that don't know about what we offer, we do have this membership community, and every month, if you are a member, we have an Ask Our CEO Anything, so it's AKA Ask Kristen Anything. We'll have an insider talk from an Irrational Labs person that's for members only, and then this event today is our big, fun, super exciting open event that everybody can come to and learn about applying behavioral design, behavioral science in the field. If you are taking one of our courses, we have three. We have kind of an intro to behavioral design. We have a finance specialization for behavioral design and a health specialization. You're automatically a member if you purchase one of our courses. They're incredible. They're great fun. And hopefully we have some of our course folks here today. That said, in case you're confused, Irrational Labs, we are a consultancy. We go into companies and we do large engagements with them to help with product design, research and prototyping, marketing and growth, employee engagement, wellness, and we do speaking engagements and trainings as well. So should you be interested in working with Irrational Labs, we welcome you to click that button right there that says consult with us. Come join the discussion. And we generally share where our events are, what's up and coming at our Irrational Labs Luma page and on LinkedIn. So that is all the exciting commercials to start today, because we have a treat for you. As I said, we have Canadians in the mix. We have 3 Canadians in the mix. We probably have people from all over the world, but this team is from the large national bank in the province of Alberta, and they stood up a behavioral science unit in their company. And that was under the leadership of Jen Koo. And I'm going to let Jen introduce everybody, but Jen also has been a fellow and coach at Irrational Labs over the last year and a half. So we have a very warm relationship with her, and we're excited for her to tell us about her real job and the incredible stuff she's done there. So Jen, take it away.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Ryan. And I was just noticing in the Q&A, folks are saying that the chat is disabled. So I don't know, just while we kick off here, if we want to see if we can get that enabled so that we can get some dialogue going.
Yeah, we'll work on that on the back end while you roll, but thanks for noticing that. And again, just to everybody, we had such a big RSVP, we had to change to webinar at the last second, so.
No worries. And just for everyone, we can see your chat messages. So I would encourage you, if you have questions, definitely post them in the chat still, because Ryan's going to help us moderate in the back half of the session, so we really get to some dialogue and Q&A. All right. So thanks, everyone. Shout out to all my other Canadians on the call, and especially the Calgarians. It's actually minus 30 degrees Celsius here today. So if our internet seems laggy, we'll just blame the weather along the way. But we're super excited to have this opportunity to chat with you about really our experience in standing up a behavioral science unit within our organization. And so what we have planned for today, if we just move to the agenda slide, actually we're gonna maybe just do some quick intros before the agenda slide. So as Ryan mentioned, I'm Jen. I have the privilege of leading a insight, experience, and product team at ATB Financial. And I have on the call with me today, Jackie McAtee, who is our Managing Director of Experience Strategy, and Emily Schmidt, who is our lead behavioral scientist. All right. Okay, so what we have planned for this morning, I'm just going to touch a little bit on ATB and the organization that we work for to set some context. And then we're really going to share our journey in building up behavioral science within our organization. And we really see it as a 3-phased approach, which we're going to talk about: the startup phase, the pilot phase, and the scaling phase. We're going to end with a bit of a recap of the lessons learned and share some helpful tools. And then we really want to get into Q&A and dialogue. I know from the lead up to the event, many of you have reached out. Thank you so much, and have asked some questions or shared some areas where you have trickies. And so I want to make sure that we have lots of time to get into some dialogue about those things. Okay, so to give you a little bit of background about ATB Financial, we are a purpose-driven organization, and our purpose is that we exist to make it possible for our clients and for Albertans. We were founded in 1938, so we're pushing 85 plus at this point. So to give you some context around that, like we've been around for a long time, and so that means that there are definitely lots of norms, and we have a pretty solid culture. And we're a financial institution that is based in Alberta and operates within Alberta. We serve over 800,000 clients across a network of 150 branches with over more than 5,500 team members. So to give you an idea of kind of the size and scale of our organization, and in terms of what we do, I mean, it really runs the gamut of services and products from a financial institution and banking perspective. So everything from retail banking to commercial banking, through to like a wealth management organization as well. And then maybe just to add a tiny bit more context before I jump into the startup phase, Jackie, Emily, and I work within the broader, what we call CXT organization. So that's client experience and technology. And, in terms of the actual experience design practice itself, it's about 6 years old at ATB. And we started with a UX and product practice, and we've really grown that practice to include service design and now behavioral design. So it's definitely been a journey. This didn't just start yesterday. So we've had some time to build up to this moment. Okay, let's jump in. So we call this first phase, I call this first phase of the journey, the startup phase. And really, having worked in digital for over 20 years now myself, I'm no stranger to change, to leading change, and certainly as a behavioral scientist to observing change happen in organization. And I would say the conventional approach, and don't worry, I've taken this approach myself before, looks and sounds something like this, right? And maybe just in the chat, you can kind of, if you're brave enough, share whether or not you've tried this approach before as well. But it sounds something like this. So let me tell you about this great thing called behavioral science or behavioral economics. Here, read this interesting academic paper. Have you heard of Richard Thaler and Nudge? Why don't you read this book? Why don't we buy 100 copies of this book and give it to every executive within the organization? Let me present you with some facts. Let me talk about the science. Here's some evidence, right? Here are my reasons why I think we should really stand up a behavioral science unit and hire 100 behavioral scientists for the organization. So in short, I mean, I'm being a bit cheeky, but often the approach to change is one where it's an exercise in pushing and convincing and then pushing harder when people don't really get on board right away, right? And I know, especially at Irrational Labs, we would say that awareness doesn't drive behavior, but really the conventional approach starts a lot typically with, let me bring some awareness to behavioral science. In my experience, this approach rarely works. And in many cases, when you take this approach, you really run the risk of triggering what in psychology we call reactance, right, from those that we're engaging. So over the years, I have found that the most effective way to influence change actually starts with the opposite of telling. It starts with listening. And this approach is what I took for the startup phase of embedding a behavioral science unit within the organization. I started by listening. I started by engaging and connecting with stakeholders across the organization and really listening for the problems that they're trying to solve, the decisions that they were trying to make, and then more specifically, the barriers that were standing in the way of the outcomes that they were looking to drive. And here in the startup phase, I would really encourage you, go deep, really employ curiosity and cover as much as you can about their challenges. So I just put on the screen here some really high level places you could start with questions in terms of what are your priorities, what are your objectives, what problems are you trying to solve within those, what have you tried, what worked, what didn't work. And I would say the first rule of Fight Club applies here, right? Which is don't talk about Fight Club. So at this stage, restrain from talking about behavioral science. Don't use the word behavioral science or behavioral economics at this stage of the startup phase. This is really about going deep, getting curious, listening, and understanding the stakeholders across the organization. Once we've gotten curious, you then get to turn the tables, plant the seed, and ignite some of the stakeholders' curiosity. So one of the great results or impacts or outputs of actually connecting with others and getting curious about their challenges and what's on their mind is, first and foremost, it creates trust, right? So the great thing about starting with listening is that you've already bought yourself some trust with your stakeholders. And once you've established that trust and have a good understanding of your stakeholders' problems and motivations, you're now better positioned to ignite their curiosity. And as the image here suggests, one of the ways that you do that, and one of the things that's going to be really important at this stage, is how you frame and position behavioral science. And at the heart of it, because we've taken the time to really understand our stakeholders' challenges, we can now frame behavioral economics, behavioral science as a solution to their problems. Right? So do we see the difference from the conventional approach, which is like, I'm almost trying to create problems for you, versus now we can frame it as a solution to their problem. And if you can do this in a way that helps them discover behavioral economics on their own, so through questioning and planting seeds, even better in terms of influence. Right? And then the last part of the startup phase really is about removing barriers. And so the final stage is like you generate momentum for an experiment by continuing to reduce any remaining barriers. So things to think about here, most likely behavioral economics or behavioral science will be a new topic for your stakeholders. So you'll have to do some work to ease the uncertainty there. And here is where you can then bring in some corroborating evidence or some social proof, which can be really beneficial. So here, the article or the case study may be helpful, right? Not as the first thing we do, but at this stage, at the tail end of the startup phase is when your stakeholders might really benefit from reading a case study now or hearing about how other organizations like ours are using behavioral science to drive value within their organization. And it's really important here to remember what you've learned from your stakeholders and use that as a reference point. We've heard the kind of adage around meeting people where they're at, right? And so understanding your stakeholders' reference points is going to be really important, because you want to use that reference point as a starting place and use that reference point to position any ideas as a gain, as additive, right, to the work that they're doing. And with that, I would say, don't take too big of a swing or try to solve too much at once. And Emily's going to talk a little bit more about this, but take a baby step forward from where your stakeholders are at, right? That's about the size of experiment that you want to really come back to with them. Is not that we'll solve everything, but let's take a step together. And then finally, and then this is good UX practice as well, I would say ease is important here. So make it easy for them to participate in an experiment so that as soon as their curiosity is ignited, we're ready to go. And so just before I hand off to Emily to talk a little bit more about the experiment that we were able to tee up, I want to wrap by just reviewing 3 key lessons from the startup phase. So the first one is to be careful about reactants. Right? So the first rule of Fight Club, remember that, don't talk about behavioral science. Get curious and really learn about their priorities and their problems. The second, for all of the behavioral economics folks on the call, is around prospect theory. Really get at their reference points, understand where the stakeholders are and use that to frame up BE or behavioral science as a solution to their problem. And the third is all around ease and thinking in small steps, not giant leaps, and being ready to capitalize on their curiosity. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emily to talk about our pilot phase.
Awesome, thank you. So that's the precursor, and we'll get into our first experiment that we ran as a freshly minted behavior design department here at ATB. So we'll get into the nuts and bolts of it. So we wanted to start with the problem of new ATM adoption. So this is kind of nice because I'm sure all of us have gone to a bank, so we have a reference point for this. But I'm just talking about those machines in the vestibule that you can do your transactions on. And we realized there was some stagnating adoption, and we had rolled out these big, beautiful new machines, and we had some stagnating adoption for clients actually using them. So we were thinking about that problem, and there's kind of a few aspects to it. On one hand, there's a poor client experience, right? Everyone's going up to the teller line, and there's these long wait lines. And then on the other hand, there's a business impact component to it too, where we know it's much more costly for us to serve clients over the teller desk than when they use a self-serve tool like the ATM. So that's kind of at the Venn diagram of, client experience, business impact. So it was a really good place for us to lean into. So we took a look at the data. 37% of our clients had actually not increased their share of digital transactions for several years from 2019 onwards. So that was interesting to say, okay, there's a bit of a plateau there, stuck. And we looked at the science behind why that might be, specifically in the context of ATMs. And we saw a few different cognitive biases or heuristics at play. So one of them was status quo, right? When clients walk into a bank, they're used to going up to the teller desk, and that's what they've always done. So that's what they continue to do, right? They're minimizing the amount of effort it takes to move through their day and just going with what they know. So that was one aspect. Another aspect was cognitive overwhelm, not so much in the sense of how do I use the machine, but more around the context when it's appropriate to do so. So clients were curious around, can I deposit this volume of check into the ATM, or are these mini checks allowed in the ATM? So there was a little bit of unclarity or poor understanding mapping around when should I use the ATM. The other one that I wanted to touch on was social proofing. We know that as humans, we're just wired to look to the group and do what the group is doing. So when clients would walk into the branch and they see everybody lined up at the teller desk, then of course, me too, and they line up in the teller desk. And there's a component also, I think, is self-determination theory as well when it comes to relatedness. So we had a lot of clients, particularly in rural contexts, where they like to go on a routine, maybe it's every Wednesday they go and visit Carol, their favorite teller, and they have that moment of connection too. And particularly in rural communities, people that work at the bank also are their friends and on the PTAs, and they're really connected in. So there was that longing for connection that was driving that behavior as well. So what did we do? Our experiment was to shift one of the roles of the teller into being a client specialist. And they were a roamer. They would greet clients at the door, or they would walk the line when there was a long teller line and connect people into the ATM. And there's a few components in that. So one was just breaking the status quo. So when people are going into the branch, they would catch them and say, hey, what are you here for? If it's a simple transaction, can we help you over here? The other piece, which was really important, was that real warm moment of connection to say hi and use the client's name and really talk to them about their needs. And we found we can actually play with the amount of time that we spend personally connecting with our clients. It's not that we want to take that away, but actually, a minute was enough to satisfy that need of connection, not the 7 minutes it would have taken to do the transaction at the desk, which was interesting. And the final piece in that was understanding mapping. So we were really particular around our script to make sure that we were linking new concepts to a concept that they already knew. So when it was, the question of, can I deposit this volume? It was, yeah, anything you can do at the teller, like you can do that at the ATM too. So making sure that we were drawing the connection. And then there were some logistical barriers too that we removed. If there was technical things with their account, we had a laptop with that client specialist so they could just address it on the spot. So that experiment resulted in a 6.2% increase in our average daily users in that test branch compared to our control period, which is great to see. It's always good to see the numbers, but I think what that speaks to as well is the client experience, right? Better flexibility for our clients, lower wait times. And it meant that when clients did have more complicated transactions, we were actually able to take time with them and get into more of the advice space with their clients. So that was really encouraging to see. So that's the case, and that's kind of the shiny, what I would maybe present at a high level. But because we're nerds here on the call, we want to really get into it. This is the under the hood look, or the behind the scenes curtain of what that was like as we go through it. So the first part was the socialization. To Jen's point, this really came about because we had a really good relationship we were fostering with our payments team, so that when they rolled out the new ATMs, they actually felt comfortable coming to us and saying, hey, like, we actually have stagnating adoption. Can you help us with this? The other piece was really exploring the problem. So yes, there was, understanding our audience and getting to why they were doing the behavior that they were doing. But I think really making sure that we looked at the data and pushed our stakeholders a little bit to get at the why behind their question. So when they said, we want to drive adoption of our new ATMs, the brain might automatically go to, okay, the change is the new ATM. So is it a problem with the features or the way the machines are or the layout? But actually, when we go into the data, it was that stagnation that was happening before the new ATMs rolled out. So that was important to say, oh, okay, this is a human problem. This is not the machine. So I think this is tricky because often stakeholders will come to you with a really defined problem that they just want you to solve. And often that problem is really a symptom of something else. So if you can push back and get at the why behind what they're asking for and look for data and gather your own insights, that's a really helpful piece so that you don't end up solving for a symptom versus a problem. So then we moved into the diagnose phase where we literally behavior mapped out the process. So we said, okay, what's the current behavior that's happening? What's our ideal behavior and all the mini behaviors that go into that. And we ran a workshop with our stakeholders and really people that worked in the front lines that talk to clients all the time. I think this is another misstep that's easy to fall into is, oh, I understand what my behavior is like at a bank, so I'll just do it from my perspective, which of course, then you miss all these things and you have all kinds of biases happening. So being able to talk to people that are actually on the front lines and they talk to clients and they understand use cases and how people behave was really important. And then it goes into the design phase of understanding, okay, what barriers are happening and what benefits, but then what do we want to focus on? So when we looked at all the things that were causing that behavior, social connection, okay, maybe we can play with that. Status quo, maybe we can interrupt that. But there were other barriers that came up that felt really entrenched, like this idea of I don't trust machines, or, if I use the ATM, the government gets my data. So that barrier, that perception is linked in with all kinds of different things and viewpoints, and that's a real entrenched opinion that's really hard to shift. So part of it is getting strategic and picking your line and saying, okay, where can we actually get the most traction? Where is the most movement? So that was a piece of chatting with our frontline team. The other piece in that was really making sure to design good controls and good measurements to say, okay, what does success look like compared to what, and how is the mechanism going to be set up so that we gather that. And again, this is a partnership piece. When we first looked at it, I was thinking, okay, we'll measure volume that goes through the ATMs. It's a natural kind of assumption. But I was talking to one of our product operations folks that was saying, the spread of clients is so different. Like we have retail clients and we have business clients. So it means what they're depositing is so dramatically different. And, a business might come in and deposit a check that completely skews your data. So you actually want to look at average daily users. And that was really helpful. Again, someone that's familiar with the use case. We might have caught that mistake on our own, but there's all kinds of nuances in there that without chatting with people, you could easily mistake. So that was a good learning in the process. And then we got into the experiment. So the juicy part of it. We had all of our best laid plans around, okay, this is the best branch, it's the most strategic based on the demographic of the neighborhood it's in and its transaction volume, and we had come up with this perfect idea. And then we just had trouble getting momentum with them, to be honest. They were busy, it was hard to get them on the phone, it was hard to convince them why they should try this experiment when they had a ton of other things on the go. And we heard through the grapevine, hey, so-and-so is a really innovative branch manager, like maybe give them a call. So I connected with them, and in a week we had our experiment launched. So it was a really good example or learning to say, okay, where is there traction? Who in the organization is actually going to champion your exercise and be willing to try a few things out and actually has the keenness and the agility to make things happen. So that was a really good learning. In that, it was helpful to also set up a two-way communication channel with our team so that they could give us feedback around how the experiment was going as we were progressing. And we got some really interesting intel from them as we were going through. So the client specialist that was doing the experiment said, you know, I've noticed when I catch people at the door, they're really open to going to the ATM. But if I am walking the line and trying to get them to go to the ATM, they're really resistant. It's almost impossible to get them to move. And that was really interesting. And my hypothesis is sunk cost fallacy, right? People don't want to waste the 5 minutes that they've already spent in line by going to the ATM. Even if they did that, the whole transaction maybe is 7 minutes, and by staying in line, it's 20 minutes. But if you've ever waited for a bus and you just like keep waiting because you're like, it has to show up at any moment here. At least that same idea of like, you don't want to lose the time you've invested. Another really interesting learning that came out of this, the client specialist said, when I'm in my Blazer, people respond a lot better to me. And I was, oh, okay, there's cues of authority happening here. So we started to experiment with nameplates and official signage, and all those little kernels were so helpful to iterate the experiment in live time and take those learnings and then be able to apply it to our next round of the experiment of, okay, let's try it in 11 branches with 2 months of data. But being able to take those directional indications in the first round and really treat it as a real fertile learning ground to then be able to pull those into a second round of an experiment and to start knowing, okay, several iterations of an experiment is just the normal part of the process, and being really comfortable with that. And then scaling from there, which Jackie will talk about in a minute. So to summarize these key learnings in the pilot phase, the first I'd say is don't fall to diminishing returns, just start. We've all heard that 80-20 rule of 80% of your effort goes into 20% of the final components of the project. And at a point you just lose traction and you're not very efficient with your time. And if you're too precious about your experiment or you're fussing and trying to make it be the perfect thing, it just is really hard to get out there and start to get quick learnings and gain momentum. So, I always think of the thought of a good experiment that gets out there is much better than a perfect experiment that never sees the light of day. And I would also say, Jackie has been really helpful in coaching around 2 speeds, right? And I think as behavioral scientists, we are looking at what are the barriers that are causing these behaviors, and some of them are systemic to the organization and big things. So I would say look to what you can action now and what you can move now while you work on those big things, but don't let that hold you up. And actually some of the reputational clout you'll get and some of the momentum from these small wins actually make those bigger rocks much easier to push. The second is around understanding mapping, just making it salient with a concrete example. It's so funny. I've had the experience of, talking to someone for, 10 minutes about what I do, and then showing the same person a slide like I did before, and they grasp it so quickly. So I think being able to show a concrete example, using a case study with visuals is really helpful. And also if you can find a goal that, everybody in the organization kind of knows, like a problem that has some awareness and we know, oh yeah, this is a thing that we need to focus on, makes it all the more personally relevant to folks. And my final one is around giving good feedback. So we know choice architecture, we build a system that gives the user feedback. Similarly, we need to be building in those measurements so it's very clear to say, okay, with empirical evidence, this was the ROI of that effort, and making it measurable. And sometimes I can feel a bit of a stickler, kind of pushing and making sure that we have good measures and targets in place, but it has paid off every single time. Because it gives the organization something to evaluate the execution and then say, okay, this has value. And the nuance there, I'd say it's also important to communicate around failures. I think the tendency is like, oh, okay, maybe if we just ignore it, it'll go away and we like don't have to address it. But that's almost worse, I think, because your stakeholders have really helped you create this experiment. They've put time into it. And then there's a chance that they might feel that that time is wasted. So if you can come back and say, okay, this didn't work. These are 3 things that we think caused that. And this is how we're iterating and changing our experiment to try again. Then it feels like that's really valuable learning and they really participated in something that's still quite meaningful. So being brave and communicating about the wins as well as some of the learnings, I think is important. So that's our pilot. That was our first experiment. And now Jackie's going to talk about, great, you've done that. Now, how do you scale it up? Oh, Jackie, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, you had that on mute moment, Jackie, but it's a cool one.
A Zoom meeting isn't a Zoom meeting without an unmute moment.
Yeah, Jackie, you're still.
So just because I'm presenting is why I was muted. So I might have to quickly ask someone else to present for me, if we can do that one.
Okay, so it wouldn't let us do both at the same time. Interesting.
No. All these quirks that we're learning about from Zoom. So thank you so much, Jen, for helping me out there. As Emily mentioned, we're now at the scaling phase. We've generated some energy and we've done a few pilots. So the question is, what happens next from there? So we'll get the slides up, but I'll just keep moving on here. The first phase we identified here in this scaling was around awareness. Once we started delivering experiments and we had evidence of the impact and the value of behavioral science, it was really about creating that awareness of the practice to the broader organization. We were keen to keep discovering additional projects that could be improved by behavioral design and to prove that value. Awareness at this point was also about naming the practice of behavior design. By giving it that name and getting out of the Fight Club mentality that Jen mentioned, we were able to make it feel more official. And that's that cue that helped stakeholders view the work as a concrete process that could address their objectives. The next phase, and there's a slide at the end that summarizes all of this, so don't worry about the slides too much right now. We'll get you there and have that presenting. As we continued, the next phase we went into was optimize. So as we continue to demonstrate the value of behavioral science across a variety of projects, we start to leverage behavioral design as an integral part of solutions across those disciplines. We look for ways to integrate behavior science into larger projects with more impact. And we continue to share the results, like the slide that Emily shared, and educate a wider audience on what behavioral design was, what behavioral science is. So demonstrating the value of the practice meant we communicated our proof points. We told the story in a really simple way for the enterprise to understand. This is not a scientific case study. This is not sending out a journal article, as Jen mentioned it very early on. This was really about a 2-page document that had 3 headings: the brief, the approach, and the results. There were links there, of course, to dive deeper into the more scientific details of behavioral science, but that consistent template and those visuals really did help audiences grasp the cases and get there quicker. The next phase we went into was Thrive. So in this phase, we continued to work with our favorite internal teams and support them with more of our work, the good old land and expand practice, while at the same time we were developing a commitment from those teams to work with our behavioural design folks as part of their ongoing plans. They would start reaching out to us and collaborating with us. Like, here's our list of upcoming projects. What makes sense for behavioural design to work with us to help us achieve our objectives? It was important to Jen and Emily and myself to make sure we had a diversified portfolio of work examples and that we were working on different initiatives across the enterprise. And in that way, we were able to showcase behaviour design's relevancy to multiple departments and areas. There were those early adopters in our community, as Emily mentioned, and they had this tangible evidence of behavioural science that helped their work and they often spoke to others on our behalf. And so that was really what helped us build a thriving practice. And the work comes from that group that we had as the community very early on, and from others that have heard about the success. With the wins and evidence that we had, we started to look at other complementary areas where behavioral science would be an easy adoption and buy-in. Areas like change management, who could quickly see the application to their practice. What we were able to do with behavior science was give the change management team a few more tools to sharpen their work even more and make it easier for them to deliver on their objectives. At this point, it became clear from where I was sitting that it was a balance of doing the work and drumming up the new business in other areas of the organization. So we continue to be busy doing the work, and we've had to be intentional about pausing to understand what areas within the organization can we add value to that we haven't had the opportunity to work with just yet. For us, that's been our UX design area. As Jen mentioned at the start, that practice is really mature. It's been around for about 6 years within the organization. And so we just haven't been pushing to embed behavior design in their processes just yet. Having said that, in your organization, UX design might be the ideal place to start up and improve the discipline of behavioral science. And now we're at the formalized stage. So this is where we are today. This is 12 months after starting the practice and 8 months after hiring a full-time behavioral scientist that is Emily. This is where we're at. We're going back and building a lot of the templates and the processes so we don't have to start from scratch every time. We want these to be repeatable, and that's how we'll continue to grow the practice in an efficient manner. How we embed behavior design into the organization's operating models is still something that we're working on. What we do know that is companies that are design-led tend to outperform companies without that muscle. And behavior design is another tool in our toolkit to help our internal partners achieve their objectives. So my 3 lessons from the scaling phase. Build social norms. Get to a tipping point of support internally and leverage the social proofing from those engagements to build momentum. Case studies that clearly and simply tell the story are super valuable. Back that up with the data and you really are on a winner. Another one that you've heard before, keep it simple. Make behavioral science salient with concrete examples from your organization. It's great that Uber has a behavioral science unit, but that doesn't help lift the goals and objectives within your organizations for your stakeholders. So continue to anchor to your organization and the mental models at play within it. And the last one was to work towards having behavioral science as the default for the enterprise. Have it embedded into the processes of not only the design teams, but also the product teams, the enablement teams, the change management teams. So that's for me. And Jen, I'm going to hand it back to you for a bit of a summary.
Amazing. And thanks, Jackie. And thank you for everyone's patience with the technical challenges. I always say to my team, it's a live show, people. And so sometimes things go wrong and we just have to keep rolling. So just to recap before we go into Q&A, and I saw lots of really great questions come in through the chat, so thank you for that. For us, this is about sharing kind of the process we went through and how we sort of broke down the journey to embedding BSI within our organization. We really see it as a 3-step process. There's this initial startup phase, right? And that startup phase is really around reducing the barriers to an experiment. I think that's the key goal or key behavior of the startup phase. The second phase is the pilot phase where you actually do the experiment. And the third phase is where you finally get to communicate and kind of go broader in your messaging and sharing out and creating a community. And that's how you really get to scale. We do have some templates that we've created along the way to help us in our work. And we'll make sure maybe to pop up a slide with our information or hit us up on LinkedIn. We're happy to share and to create a broader community related to BSI and embedding BSI within organizations. So reach out for any of these templates. These are just things that we've created along the way. And then I think that's it for us, Ryan. I think I'm happy to kind of open it up to Q&A because I know there was lots of really great questions.
Yeah, let's do that. Let me remove the pins here. So so to Team ATB, feel free to look at those questions in the Q&A bank, and if one moves you, let's let you take those. That said, my play is going to be like this. I'm going to just kind of go through this as I see them, and I think we have too many people to unmute here. But I think if I click answer live, I think people can ask their questions. So let's see. I'm going to start with Adam because he's a known entity. So I'm going to click answer live and see if that lets Adam ask his question. Adam, do you now have the ability to talk? That's probably a no. So I will go look, and Adam's question's easy. It was, what sort of bureaucratic issues did you face and how did you overcome them? I think everybody might have a response to this.
Yeah, and I think for me, the bureaucratic issues are in our organization, because we are, like I said, 85 years old and 5,500 team members. It's really just more around, there are a lot of stakeholders, right? And so that startup phase is really important. And I think that's how we overcame our bureaucratic issues, is to make sure that we were spending time in that startup phase, meeting and connecting with all kinds of different groups in the organization and really getting to know them and understanding, the highest priorities in terms of problems to be solved. And so I think the larger the company, I saw a question in there about a small company, 30 people or so. I would say it's the same 3-step process. It's shorter because you probably have a lot less people that you need to connect with in your startup phase.
Anyone want to build on that?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and add that I think that's true on the high socialization level, and then it also happens on the implementation level. And it comes from a good place, right? You're working with the team to implement an experiment, and they want to bring in this team, and this one person from their perspective to consult. And that's really good in the exploration phase. But then I think when you get to implementing, you really need to narrow it down and be a little selective in who your small working group is, because it can just take forever with that large of a group for consultation. So I'd say know when to go broad for the implementation advice and then when to narrow it in. And then the other piece to that is, like any organization, people have their own priorities and goals. And if you come, with the different teams' priorities and goals, they're willing to help, but ultimately they're held to task for their deliverables. So I think it's an exercise in framing, and I call it the 2-for-1. The more you can thread that needle and show, okay, this solution helps this objective and this one, the easier time you'll have getting people on board.
Jackie, did you have any additional thoughts? Oh, you're still muted. There you go.
Again, twice. Like, do I get a record or something for that?
Third time's a charm.
Yeah. It's minus 31 here, so everyone has to give us just a little bit of grace this morning.
The only thing I would make a comment for anyone that is actually a behavioral scientist on the call, one of the areas that Emily and I worked super closely with was to not be too scientisty, not to be too nerdy about the science, because regular folk can't grasp it. And so it was really about giving folks a connection, and that helped with the bureaucracy. It helped them get over the hump to understand it a little bit more.
Awesome. That was a great question because it was super broad. This one is from Manesh. I'm going to click answer live and see if he goes to the top. No, he doesn't. Okay, so I'm going to read it. Manesh wanted to know, how can you clearly attribute results to the specific behavioral intervention? Could other variables influence, and could other variables be an influence, and how do you factor these in when collecting evidence and attribution? So this is an RCT question for the team. So take it away.
I can take a kick and then hand it off. So my favorite is control group, right? The more you can get into a place where you have a control group of your people that aren't receiving an intervention, and then you have your test group, and they're very similar, and you do some good science to make sure that they're representative of each other, then it's great because you've controlled for factors like time or those kind of pieces that can play into the results. So where you can, I'd say use a control group compared to a test group. So you can say, with our intervention, this, worked, this didn't, here's the delta or the difference between the two. We have come across moments where it's really hard to do a control group because let's say we're working with a platform that we change the design of the platform. It's a global shift, and you can't have some people see one version of the platform and other people see a different version. Or like the ATM example, we didn't want to compare it to a different branch because the factors there were so different. Location, clientele, all those things really shifted by branch. So in those cases, we use a control period and try to factor out things that might shift it. So for example, we took a period of time and then looked at the similar period of time with historical data using a weighted average to factor out things like month end or things like that we know are really going to skew the data. So not our favorite, but something that we use in a pinch if a control group actually feels like it's either A, not possible, or B, going to introduce more bias than a control period would. So bit of a technical answer, but I think that's how I would recommend navigating it.
Yeah, there's another experimentation question, but does anyone else want to talk about your control? Okay, look at both. No, we're good. We're good. Emily handled it. Well, to those ends, and we've actually had member talks on this very issue. So Rebecca asked, she said, hey, experimentation has been really challenging in my company. Lack of infrastructure, context. We don't have the tools up. Did you experience any challenges like this in reducing experimentation barriers, and how did you overcome them? So I know you answered some of this question now, but I think there's more to it. So anyone else want to talk about that?
Jen, I think this is a great one for you to start off how you helped us get there with experimentation.
Look at that. Nice baton pass. Nicely done.
I'm looking at so many of these questions that are around kind of barriers or how did you overcome things, and it's the same advice that I keep coming back to, which is take the time, right? Like slow down, take the time, take small steps, right? Don't be too precious. Like we know what a perfect experiment, in a textbook looks like. That may not be your first at bat is the perfect experiment, but we'll build up to that, right? Emily shared our very, very first one. And part of it was just because that was the group that said, yeah, they put up their hand, right? And so we jumped on it. Since then, we have a whole collection of different experiments that we've run. And I would say that we've gotten better and more scientific with more rigor with each one. right, Emily? Like each one we've been able now to build upon, but we weren't too precious at the start. At the start, it's really about trying and getting going, right?
Yeah.
And so it was pushing for that. Not pushing, pushing is the wrong word, but finding the opportunity for that.
Yeah, and I think like since, you know, like so much around like this comes down, I think, to the experimental mindset of like how comfortable is your group with failure. So finding the pockets that are a little bit more comfortable, whether that's, you know, the person or the team culture of that specific team. Because I've had some stakeholders say like, we can run this, but it can't fail. And then that puts you in a tricky spot of like, well, we're not really experimenting then, right? So we need to find the places in the organization that have a little bit less of that pressure or feel a bit more open to it. And I really resonate with like the data infrastructure one. That is a real tough one. My one tip or something I might try is look to the literature, see if someone else has done an experiment that's similar, that has the data infrastructure that you can say, okay, empirically, this worked in their context. I'd like to try it here. And you have a bit of that data. It's not as personalized to your context, but at least it's something to go on to build a bit of a case for why you might want to experiment in your space.
You know, Emily, just building on your point you made there, at Irrational Labs, we talk about the just do it's. So like, there's certain things that we just don't experiment on. Like, for example, we know social proof is going to work in almost every context. So like adding a testimonial to a web page is not an RCT, right? Like we just know that's good practice. Whereas once you get into more complex flows and more unique contexts, then the experimentation is really important. And with that, I did want to tie this over to Elsa's question. She said, hey, you know, is there any step in the process that you think wouldn't work for a very small company? So, I mean, what you've done is remarkable because you're a legacy organization and you've managed to stand this up in an incredibly large bureaucracy with great success. And we all marvel in that. But what would you say to the people with little companies? Any thoughts when you reflect on your process in a different context?
It's so funny, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Like I almost feel like it's so much easier in a 30-person company than in a company our size, because I can tell you, you know, it looks like a small phase when we show it on a slide, but that startup phase was we have a lot of people that we needed to connect with and talk to, right? And get curious about. I mean, that was a really long process for us before we got to like an experiment that we could run. So I'll open it up to maybe Jackie and Emily for their perspective. From my perspective, nothing changes in the process. If anything, I feel like you might have it easier with 30 people.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that if you've got a smaller company, you've got much more personal relationships. So that trust is already there because it's a small group. You know everyone in the team. And so therefore going to them and saying, hey, I have an idea. I'd like to try this. Can we experiment? Here's what I'm going to think about doing. These are the steps. Are you willing to try it with me? You've actually got a lot more of a personal relationship that you can lean on to make that happen. So that's where I would come from if you've got a smaller company versus a bigger company where you may not have as tight relationships with folks. Emily?
Yeah, just a final thought on that. Like in my previous organization, it was a 50-person company. Actually, maybe at that time it was more like 35 people. And it was, you know, coming to ATB and we have 5,000. It's a big spectrum. But I think the challenge in that context was budget and data infrastructure always were like the key thing. So although the relationships are easier, you just feel like you're working with less. And the idea of like an experiment is like, oh, we need to put all our resources into just doing the thing, let alone trying to experiment on top of it. So I would say look for your moments where you can replace instead of add an experiment. So for example, in that role, I was the director of marketing. So I said, you know what, we're campaign structuring anyways. This is part of the work. So then we used behavioral science lens to look at, okay, what are the psychological triggers that would compel people to visit our destination? It's in a tourism context. So we used behavioral science to inform something that we were already doing. instead of add an experiment on top. The tricky then is showing the delta or the difference. So that's where that is a bit challenging. But if you can get a bit of a win there to say, okay, historically compared to what we did last year, look at the difference, then that might give you a little bit more permission to use resources or time to do a little bit more of an empirical study.
That is awesome. I think the question that I wanted to ask you just vanished. That person may have had to leave. So I'll give you one last question, and then from Andrew, and then we'll close with Avani's question. But Andrew asked, "How can you help colleagues feel better with failing?" In quotes. They put in quotes.
That's all about framing, right? What someone sees as a failure, you can reframe as, here's what we learned. Right. So for us, it's never about a failure. It's always about framing it as, here are the lessons that we learned, and immediately, here's how we're applying it or how we can apply it to achieve a different result. So Andrew, I would say it's all in how you frame it up.
And I think I can squeeze one more question, because that was an excellent answer that we can go to. What Majdi wanted to know, what made you select that specific branch to start the experimentation out to all 150? I think this is a great, super specific question. Anyone?
I'll start, then Emily can jump in. They picked up the phone. Like literally, it's that simple. When you're looking for someone to experiment, who's going to pick up the phone and help us out? That was where we started from. Emily?
Yeah, exactly. We had, real best laid plans around this is the most strategic pick, but we weren't getting traction. So go with where you're getting traction. And the irony after that success, then we wanted to scale it out to 11 branches. And I had 20 branches reach out and say, I want to participate. One of them was the one that we had chatted with before, which sometimes I think it again speaks to that like fear of failure mindset. Is like, okay, like that branch wasn't at the early end of the adoption curve. Like that's okay. Like pick someone that is, and then you can fold in that participant or that data set later when there's a little bit more comfort built up. So I think it speaks to social proofing, right? If someone can, show that they're comfortable with it, everybody else gets comfortable with it.
That's awesome. Somebody just said, and this is a nice closure, Leon said, people want help. I've always found it easier when I come with a solution to something that stakeholders are struggle with, and starting with easy wins, low-hanging fruits. I mean, this is just kind of building on what you said. And then somebody just asked, like, is it easier? I'm trying to find the question because they keep moving around. But it was like, is it easier to kind of build out a team internally, or should you bring in a consultant to do this? And the answer is it depends, right? So what we do here at Irrational Labs, someone asked why we're named Irrational Labs. One of our co-founders is Dan Ariely. His most famous book is Predictably Irrational. So that's that answer. And we find a lot of times, right, it's really powerful for us to go into a team and just be like, they pick a little experiment, we run it out, and they can see the benefits quickly. And then this kind of is another way to build momentum in an organization. But I think, Jen, what you've done here is really interesting in the sense that you were able to assemble a team to do this. How would you say the two modes are different? The bring a consultant in to run an experiment versus I'm going to stand up a team in my organization.
Yeah, I think you answered it. It depends, but I would definitely say that for me, I had the benefit of having a master's in behavioral economics and sort of really understanding the science and working in the design space. But if that's not what your background looks like, I would highly recommend Irrational Labs. I think I answered the question there as well. I think what's great about Irrational Labs is that there's various different consulting engagements that look like everything from helping to actually run an experiment to helping actually just inform and champion behavioral science within your organization, right? And so I think it's a great option for someone who's interested in scaling or starting or even just running an experiment and driving some results to share out. So would definitely say +1 to Irrational Labs.
Well, and plus 300 to you all today in ATB. I mean, this is an incredible story in a large organization, and it's very, very cool to see the whole team. My favorite answer by far was they picked up the phone. This is the super scientific. How did we choose our experimentation site? They picked up the phone. If you remember nothing, remember just, but I think this goes to your whole thesis, right? Like go out there, just do it, just experiment. Some things will go wonderfully. Some things will be learnings, not failures. It was incredible to hear from all three of you today. So if we could give everybody virtual rounds of applause to Jackie, Emily, and Jen, our minus 31 degree team in Calgary, who's really, though, it was a hot presentation, so we'll give you 100 degrees Fahrenheit from our neck of the woods. Thank you again. Reach out to them on LinkedIn. You know, they're happy to field any questions over there. I also put in the chat the URL for our newsletter. If you are not an Irrational Labs newsletter subscriber, we'd love to have you in the mix. And we will have another exciting event next month, so watch our feed on the Twitters and the LinkedIns. But thank you again to Team ATB today. I wanted to say ATV, which is an all-terrain vehicle, not to be confused with your Treasury. So everybody have a great day, and we will talk to you all at the next event. Yeah, I'm looking to stop the recording. Oh, there it is.